Hey there, folks. Welcome to Advisory. Hope you are all doing well. Happy Red Ribbon Week. Today is Nerd Day, and I actually dress as a nerd every day. You see these spectacles? I am about this life. Plus, all my good bow ties are in the dry cleaners. That's right, this week is Red Ribbon Week, and it's a week where, in Advisory and through a few other activities throughout the week, we're going to be talking a lot about drugs. Today's video is going to cover the origins of Red Ribbon Week, the history of the drug trade here in the United States, as well as a peek inside a fentanyl cartel that was done by a group of investigative journalists. Red Ribbon Week began in 1985 to honor a DEA agent named Enrique Kiki Camarena, who was kidnapped, tortured, and eventually murdered by the cartel in Mexico while working undercover. Kiki's family started wearing red ribbons, and it eventually expanded into an annual where students all across America wear red ribbons, do dress-up days with a focus of educating folks about drugs. And that is exactly what we are going to do this week in Advisory. First, we're going to start with this video here that is all about the history of the American drug trade. I want you to pay very close attention to it and try to get 3 or 4 facts or things that you didn't know or things that surprised you about the American drug trade. And then we're going to look at this video, which is an investigative news piece that interviews members of a fentanyl cartel in Mexico and explains in detail how it gets processed, how it gets shipped, and what the motivations are of the people who are making and distributing these drugs. And I should mention that that video is not meant to be a focus solely on Mexico and Mexican cartels. In fact, according to the DEA, most fentanyl that makes its way into the United States actually comes to us from China. And the point of the video is really not where the fentanyl is coming from or who is to blame for where the fentanyl is coming from. The point of the video is to show you how any cartel that makes this stuff acts and what their motivations are behind making these drugs. And I want you to watch that carefully as well, because there will be discussion questions after both of these videos. Before we go into these videos, I do want to mention that some of the things that you're going to see and hear about this week surrounding drugs may be upsetting. I want to acknowledge that there are many people among us that are either struggling with addiction or know someone who is struggling with addiction and has been either directly or indirectly affected by the opioid crisis and other drug-related things. And so I want to make sure that we know what we're going into. The things that we're going to talk about are very serious, but we are going to do our best to think about it in an academic sense to really look at everything objectively. But if looking at these videos and talking about these things is too tough, that's okay, and I understand. But either way, I hope you learn a lot from these next 2 videos.
Although the drug cartels operating today have existed for only a few decades, they have their roots in a long history of drug smuggling in the Americas. Smugglers and law enforcement evolved together in this cat-and-mouse game, which began when the old world collided with the new. In the early colonies, import taxes were a major source of government income, but they were almost impossible to collect. The main smuggled drugs of the time were tea, tobacco, rum, and the molasses that were used to make it. The birth of the United States was partially triggered by British attempts to clamp down on these trades, which led to riots and the infamous Boston Tea Party. Now, at the same time, the British were illegally smuggling opium from their Indian colonies into China, and they even waged 2 wars to keep the trade going. This was probably around the same time that we earned our reputation for irony. But it also indirectly created the Mexican drug trade, when Chinese immigrants introduced opium poppies to Sinaloa state. They begin to feed an unregulated US market, where you could literally buy heroin out of a catalogue, visit a hash parlor, and drink Coca-Cola that actually contained cocaine. But during the early 1900s, these drugs become linked to crime and racist stereotypes, and are outlawed along with alcohol. Smuggling becomes rampant, especially rum from British colonies. The colonial secretary at the time calls the law an affront to the whole history of mankind. The harder enforcement increases traffic in harder drugs, which are easier to smuggle and more profitable, overtaking alcohol after prohibition ends. The US goes to war in 1941, and they look south for reliable supplies of opium to produce medical morphine and hemp for ropes and parachutes. Cultivation skyrockets in response. But after the war, the US pushes drug prohibition internationally. Mexico launches its first military eradication program, while Peru outlaws cocaine, sending the indigenous coca industry underground. Chilean processors rebuild the trade by trafficking to Cuba, a haven for drugs, gambling and prostitution since Prohibition. It's wildly popular in Havana during the 50s, but in 59, most organized criminals flee Castro's revolution to the US, bringing the trade with them. The culture changes dramatically in the 60s when marijuana and heroin become relatively mainstream. Soon, Mexican producers can barely meet the growing demand.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
President Nixon retaliates with the war on drugs in '71, tightening the border and pressuring Mexico to spray plantations from the air. Americans become terrified of being poisoned by tainted joints, and they turn to Colombian weed, smuggled in via the Caribbean. The remaining Mexican traffickers survive by forming the Guadalajara and Gulf cartels. Cocaine begins to be seen as glamorous and safe, and production rises in Bolivia and Peru. But in '73, the major Chilean traffickers are arrested by US-backed dictator General Pinochet. The new Colombian traffickers move in on the trade, and they soon organize into their own cartels. Miami becomes the main entry point for cocaine, and soon the Colombians force out the early Cuban traffickers. The resulting turf wars around Florida brings them to the attention of the police, but it's the rise of crack cocaine and its association with crime and minorities which triggers a national panic.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children.
In response, President Reagan launches a series of offensives against smuggling in the Caribbean. The cartels shift to routes through Central America, where the US is forced to turn a blind eye to its regional Cold War allies, who are profiting from the trade. The Gulf and Guadalajara cartels handle the final journey through the US border, but in 1985, the murder of a DEA agent leads to a crackdown, and the Guadalajara cartel splinters into regional groups in '89. In 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union allows the US to turn its full attention to the drug war, and they begin arming and funding cocaine eradication in Peru and Bolivia. They also assist the Colombian police in making major arrests. Pablo Escobar is killed in 1993, and the cartels are mostly dismantled by the mid-90s. However, cocaine production has relocated from Peru and Bolivia into the Colombian jungles, where it becomes entangled in a guerrilla war between the government and leftist groups. Back in Mexico, an economic crisis causes unemployment, while border flows quadruple under NAFTA. This sets the stage for Mexican cartels to increase recruitment and smuggling. Soon, they fill the vacuum left by the Colombians, becoming the dominant traffickers in the Americas. The laws of supply and demand have locked governments into a global game of whack-a-mole. When the hammer comes down, it only creates a vacuum for new traffickers and producers. And through this process of Darwinian selection, each generation becomes more organized and ruthless. History repeats itself, and even as the drug war rages, it's clear that the drug trade always finds a way.
This is Culiacán, capital of Sinaloa state and stronghold of one of the world's most powerful drug cartels. For decades, the city has been controlled by the narcos, using a combination of wealth and fear. And in these streets, songs of praise ring out for the drug lords.
Soy el ratón, soy Ovidio, soy Guzmán, hijo del Chapo. Soy hermano de Alfredito y de Archibaldo, y por cierto me disculpo por lo del Culiacanazo.
Murders happen here daily, the ultimate penalty for upsetting the cartel. But right now, it's deaths over the border in America which are getting all the attention. For years, marijuana, heroin and cocaine have all been produced and trafficked through this area. There's a heavy military presence, but the cartel is thriving thanks to a new product, fentanyl. And it's one of the most deadly drugs the world has seen.
We're driving towards the mountains of Sinaloa. This is cartel land. It's an area controlled by the sons of El Chapo Guzman. And after days of talking to a person close to the cartel, we've been granted permission to film inside a fentanyl lab, the drug that is killing thousands of people in the US.
There are now dozens, probably hundreds of fentanyl labs here in Sinaloa. No land is needed to grow ingredients. It's entirely synthetic. It's so easy and cheap to make, it can be cooked almost anywhere. We've disguised the cooks' voices at their own request.
¿Y eso lo compras en la ferretería nomás?
En bodegas de Culiacán.
Most of the chemicals are easy to find. The rest can be imported from China. Production is quick. If a shipment is seized at the border, there's always more on the way.
Gente dispuesta a comprarlo se va a producir, ¿no es cierto?
I have been to narco labs before, but I have never seen anything like this. Huge quantities of pure fentanyl cooked daily. It's an opioid like heroin, but 50 times strong. It can be diluted and made into pills, but often it's cut into other drugs to make them stronger. That is how most overdoses happen.
We've been told that there are 40 kilos of fentanyl here, ready to be sent up north to the US, where their value is more than $500,000. But this amount of fentanyl is enough to kill a whole city.
Está puro ahí. Ahí ya no se puede más fuerte.
Eso es lo más fuerte que hay. O sea, ¿cuánto de esto te mata? ¿Cuánto, un pedacito cuánto?
No, nada.
¿Unos granitos te matan?
Key ingredients from China are difficult to import directly into America, so Mexican cartels dominate production.
¿Piensas que tantos gringos estén muriendo por esto?
No, pues depende. Algunos dicen que se pasan y cuando hay material muy fuerte. Pero por ellos hay el problema de ellos, uno nomás trabaja ya. Uno solo en la fábrica, pues nadie nos obliga que se ponga nada.
Entonces tú piensas que la gente que se muere allá pues es porque ellos no saben consumirla.
Pues digo yo que sí. Mucho por equivocación que piensan que es cocaína y se mueren que no.
These men have been cooking drugs since they were boys. The cartel life is pretty much all they know. They have little sympathy for the northern neighbors.
Ellos también mandan muchas armas para acá. La mayoría de las armas que hay aquí en Sinaloa pues, son puras armas de para allá, de los gringos. Ellos mandan muchas armas para allá. ¿No? Entonces la mayoría de armas uno pues, igual busca la manera también.
Cooking fentanyl is now the most lucrative career for many young Sinaloan men. They hide their exact formula from me in case I try to steal it.
Deberían de estar destinando fondos.
Mexico's president has denied multiple times that fentanyl is produced in his country. He blames American culture for the crisis.
Hay mucha desintegración de las familias, hay mucho individualismo, hay falta de amor, de fraternidad, de abrazos, de apapachos, de atención a los jóvenes.
Obrador campaigned on demilitarizing Mexico. His slogan was hugs, not bullets. But he has vastly increased the military budget and power. More Mexicans have died during his presidency than any others. In January, just days before a visit from US President Joe Biden, the military launched a pre-dawn raid in Culiacán. They were after one of El Chapo's sons, Ovidio. The cartel fought tooth and nail to stop the arrest. These were familiar scenes. In 2019, the military tried to arrest Ovidio, but were forced to release him after heavy narco violence. This time, the military held on to him, but Culiacán was once again left looking like a war zone.
Nos llegó la noticia por el radio como a las 5 de la mañana de eso que estaba pasando y nos movimos con todo lo que teníamos.
These are sicarios, elite hitmen who carry out the cartel's murders. They battle the military to hold on to their leader. The government says 10 military and 19 cartel gunmen were killed, but the sicarios say the death toll was much higher.
No, pues hubo un enfrentamiento grande, la verdad. Muchas muertes, como del gobierno, como de nosotros también.
Sí. ¿Cuántas personas de ustedes más o menos murieron?
Pues no les sabría decir exactamente, pero unas 60 de perdida de ahí para arriba. No, pues siempre se siente mal porque también es un respaldo para uno porque hay gente, otra gente más mala que se quiere meter acá con uno y ellos se portan bien también con uno, la verdad, y le da cuenta que es una protección para toda la gente de la sierra.
I asked the gunmen how they feel about killing people on behalf of the cartel, and they told me that they consider themselves soldiers in a war against the Mexican state.
Guzmán, mi apellido es Ovidio, su padre de niño le apodo el ratón. Es hombre con mucho cerebro y es hijo del Chapo, aquel señorón.
Ovidio's story is immortalized by so-called narco corridos, songs based on traditional Mexican folk ballads. But in Sinaloa, they glorify drug lords and battles with the authorities.
Agradezco a la pleba del Jueves Negro, se rifaron por mi cuero con todos los del gobierno.
The drugs business is fully ingrained here, and ultimately the arrest of one high-profile leader does nothing. The increased production of a deadly drug like fentanyl has made things more dangerous, but while business is good, it will not stop.
Okay, from those two videos, you've got 3 very short questions to answer. The first one is, what new things did you learn about the American drug trade from that first video? Why is it significant to know this history? And then from the second video, what did you learn about fentanyl, and what are the main motivations of those who manufacture and distribute dangerous drugs like fentanyl? And there may be many motivations, so I want you to talk about all of them. Also, throughout this entire week, if you have any questions that come to mind about drugs or anything in response to the videos that we see, I want you to go to this bit.ly right here, bit.ly/capital RRW, capital Q, lowercase n, capital A. I will also have this form up on the advisory tab of Longhorn Country. But if you have any questions that you would like to see answered on our advisory videos this week, I encourage you to go to that link and ask the questions. So enjoy this discussion, and like I said, ask any questions that you want to at that link, and I will do my best to find an answer. That's all from me for today. Be good to yourself and others, and I'll see you tomorrow.